Hello, everybody. I hope you are well. I'm coming to you a little later again today to discuss The Body Keeps the Score. So if you're new to the Hive and you're not sure what this is about, we read books together, sometimes one a month, sometimes seasonally, and right now we're in a seasonal book. So during the great 50 days of Easter, we are reading this book, The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. And so some of you have submitted some quotes and questions, so we'll talk about those, and we'll just talk a little bit. And thank you for being here. I had a little bit of trouble readjusting my brain today because I had the most joyous day that I've had in a super long time, getting to watch two beloved friends get married online. It was so exciting. So it took me a little bit to get back into talking about trauma. So trigger warning, if you are coming to this book or to listen to this study and you haven't read the book yet, there in these two chapters, there's a lot of talk of things that could be triggering. So particularly war, murder, children dying, a lot of that in the first chapter. And in the second chapter, a lot of talk of abuse and rape, child abuse, and even really animal abuse in trials that were done to do some studies. So just laying that out there. If any of that is too much for you and you haven't read the book, or if you have read the book and it bothered you, just turn it off. So, all right. So to get started, we have had a couple people's questions were more about chapter 2, so we'll get to that. And please feel free to comment if you're watching and you had a question and I don't address it or didn't see it or it just pops in your mind. All right, so chapter 1 of this book was it sets out talking about, and largely talks about, Vietnam War veterans and how studying what they went through and how they've reacted and responded in coming home really helped to lay the foundation of understanding PTSD. And so he starts by talking about a person named Tom, and how when Tom came home from war, he just plunged himself into life. He got married, he had kids, I think he became a lawyer, he did all the right things, checked off all the boxes, and yet would find himself traumatized by things like loud noises and picnics and fireworks. You can think like holidays would be hard. And he also found that he had extreme nightmares, and he would outbursts at his family and things like that. And he felt very emotionally unattached to anybody, but he really mentions, like, in his marriage, he didn't feel strong emotional attachment to his wife or to his kids. And the only thing he ever felt was shame and rage. But when he began to open up about that, which took a lot, and so the author talks a lot about the privilege of doctors or whomever is able to receive the stories and the underlying stories of trauma and pain, how that's a gift and a privilege, so it's not to be taken lightly. So he talks about Tom and what Tom goes through, and how a lot of war veterans are able to talk to one another, but they can't get past that. They have a really hard time getting past the stories, and so they tell the stories, and in that way it can be helpful to an extent, or it can cause them to just keep reliving and not move on past those things. And something particularly tough to read and really made me think, and that was sad but really connected to other patterns I've seen in people with trauma, is so the doctor, the author of the book, tried to give Tom medication that would help him to sleep and not have nightmares. And he refused the medication because he felt like the nightmares were his penance for being the one living. And I am beginning to see that in my work as a priest who ministers in a military town, that is really true. Like people, there's this battle of reliving the trauma and it being attached to shame. So not really being sure how or if the trauma should be let go of because there's so much shame attached to it. So he talks a little bit about that and really starts to think about, nightmares and medication and different things like that. And then he finally, towards the end of the chapter, begins to connect the dots and realize that PTSD wasn't and isn't something that is only connected to war veterans. He began to notice that some of those same symptoms and some of those same patterns that he was seeing was also attached to and being shown in people who were abused or assaulted, law enforcement officers, all kinds of people who had experienced trauma. So not necessarily stories of war, even though that's how he introduces it. But then he begins to talk about, he really starts to lay the groundwork for our trauma doesn't, pull my book back out, our trauma isn't just something we live in the brain, we live it in the body as well. And so just talking about your trauma or just receiving medication to lighten the chemical load, which he talks about more in chapter 2, that can't do all the things because trauma impacts the body. So it will impact the way you think, what you think, how you think, and that kind of thing. But it'll also affect a person's behavior and what they feel. And it will also impact how they live among their community. And it will help, or excuse me, not help. It may help them. I don't know why I keep saying help. It may make them feel trapped in the past. They can't move on from the past. So if you're watching and you have any quotes or questions from chapter 1, I'd love to hear them because, again, most of what we got was from chapter 2. While I'm hoping some of you will type that, let me just, a couple of things that stood out to me. I didn't start reading with a highlighter because that's always a bad thing for me. I'm like, just read, Michelle. And then I finally pull out the highlighter and then it's like, everything is highlighted. So anyhow, he talks about memories. He talks about the Rorschach test. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I actually, not to like share too much of my own story, but to become a priest, you have to go through the psychological testing and you do the Rorschach test. And I remember looking, I had heard of this test. I've never taken one. I don't know. And I remember being like, they're just like blobs, but explaining what I saw in each one and how the psychologist had pages and pages of things to write about what I interpreted from those ink blots. And so he talks about the Rorschach test and how a normal person, I shouldn't say normal, that's not fair, but a person who's untraumatized can see an ink blot on a paper. And he says, just like people look up in the clouds and imagine like dinosaurs and fairies and animals and dolphins and things, people will do that with the ink blots too. But people who've been traumatized might do something differently, especially with this second ink blot, which is one that has more color in it. And he said, people who have who are suffering from PTSD or severe trauma will look at that picture and they'll do one of two things. They'll either just share something gruesome that they see, and not something beautiful and imaginative, but just gruesome. Or they'll say, I don't see a thing, because the way your brain is wired, that's what would happen. So he says the normal human response is to use our imagination to read something into things. But people who've been traumatized will superimpose their trauma on everything around them and have trouble deciphering what's going on around them. And it says, so basically people have been traumatized, just play the old reel, or as one of my friends says, they just play the same tapes over and over again. So people look at the world in a different way when they've been traumatized. And again, I just found listening to him talk about the limits of group therapy was helpful, because he said, there's so many people in PTSD or who have PTSD that it was hard to get them into therapy with a professional. And so the intermediate was group therapy, which was beautiful to a point. And kind of the extent of it was, they could share their stories and then they just kept reliving, as I said. And sometimes he says, in talking about when people share their stories, sometimes it can go too far, because one, they just keep retelling the stories over and over again, or sometimes you might inadvertently trigger a full-blown flashback, which is really problematic. I mean, it causes all the physical responses too. So he says that one of the big indicators of PTSD is that patients who have that are usually and often unable to make their past into a story that happened long ago. It always feels present. And that's where he shifts into the book to talking about women abused as children. And what really struck me was how far we probably still have to go, because how far we've come, because he started talking about in 1982. So 1982 was like 36, 37 years ago. And when he started hearing these stories of women who talked about being sexually abused as children, he said at that time, the textbook psychiatry said that incest was extremely rare, and that only 1 out of every million women experienced it. And so he was saying, well, how come like 47 of those women have found me to tell me their stories? And then he just begins to talk about how he realized that couldn't be true. And then he begins to connect PTSD to those women as well, saying that one of the things that would happen with them is they couldn't maintain meaningful relationships, or had trouble with that, and that they would rage, that they'd have long periods of being shutting down. All that stuff was true of veterans and true of women who were suffering from abuse. And then he connects the war again to people who experience abuse in their home, talking about one thing that really struck me and was painful to read was talking about each year 3 million children in the U.S. are reported as victims of child abuse and neglect. 1 million of these 3 million are serious and credible enough to force the local child protective services or the courts to take action. And he said, in other words, for every soldier who serves in a war zone abroad, there are 10 children who are endangered in their homes. And that's terrible, because usually the source of that trauma are caretakers. So that's kind of the first chapter. Mommy's in here doing a book study. So his summary of the chapter is that trauma, the past it can't be like Elsa, let it go, the past is in the past. It doesn't always work. The past feels very present. The past has left an imprint on the mind, in the body, in the brain, and that finding words is helpful, but it is not enough. There needs to be more. So then he transitions to the next chapter, because he says, for real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. So then we're going to skip ahead to the next chapter where I'll try to ramble less. Close the door, please. A little bit later, okay? I love you. Thank you. This is not a child-appropriate moment to be in the room with mommy. Oh, Diane, I'm sorry you're having computer issues. Okay, the replay will be here. All right, so the next chapter, and that's where we have some quotes and some questions from you all. He talks about revolutions in understanding the mind and the brain. So this chapter is sad. It talks, to me, this chapter, if you've had any kind of traumatic experience in your childhood or home life, this is probably one to not engage in by yourself, or to be really cautious of whether or not you need to stop reading. So put that out there. So he says that people cannot heal from their trauma unless they've accepted that it happened, that they accept the reality around them, and they're willing to understand their feelings. He says that he talks a lot about how trauma victims will re-engage in their pain, how they will, he doesn't talk about cutting, but I started to think a lot about cutting. He talked about, how people will pay someone to abuse them, or they will hurt themselves, or they will refuse to look away from things with pain, because something about the chemical release of the pain helps them somehow. There's something about that. Rhonda says sometimes when we feel like something just happened yesterday, even though it in fact happened years ago, it's a sign there's some issue or material that needs to be resolved. Totally. The book talks a lot about that. You replay, if you keep replaying the same tape, it's probably a good sign that you need to do some work, that something there needs to be worked through, and you don't need to do it alone. All right. So he talks about, he talks a lot about medicine, and he talks about psychiatric hospitals and how medicine has changed what they look like. And he talks about both the good and the dirty of that. The good being the number of people who are hospitalized have decreased severely with the introduction of lithium and Prozac and other drugs into the world. Sometimes that is enough to help people to live in the present, to be present, and to not be stuck in that pain or stuck in whatever their brain chemistry is doing to them. But he said the downside of that is that things in mental hospitals that used to be good and important have gone to the wayside, and instead we're hyper-focused on medicine. And he talked about a hospital that he worked in. They filled the pool and they put cubicles in the basketball court area, all to make room for medical things, like medicine-related things, and how that was sad. And that what really struck me was when he talked about we are only able to, trying to find what he said, but basically we're only able to treat people and help people with insofar as whatever information we have available to us is what we use. And so he talked about, in the past when we would say that people had God did it, or it was an evil spirit, or they were a witch, or this, that, and another. And now, we know that's not true. And so we've moved from it being maybe a spiritual thing to a chemical thing or disordered behavior. But even when you look at the past with that, you look at something like there are all kinds of things that are not problematic. They're not medical issues, but they were termed as such and treated as such, and it was extremely harmful. If you look at the history of how we have treated the LGBTQ community, at one point that was a diagnosed medical disorder, which is crazy. So it made me curious, what knowledge are we still searching for that will help us to treat people, and who are we misdiagnosing and who are we mistreating? But the treatment of people in hospitals was super sad. So I'll just leave that at that. But he talks about the importance of, and we'll get to it later in the book, he says, of helping people to understand that they are okay and they are safe. And that is what treatment is working towards. He talks about people needing to know in their body, in their mind and body, oh, Diane's back, yay, that they're safe and they're loved and they're comforted and all of those things. So 2 things that he brought up. So let's see, where'd it go? Someone had pointed to a lovely quote that he had from a Harvard doctor, or a Harvard professor. Oh, where'd he go? There it is. So Beth says her favorite quote was, "Healing," he told us, "depends on experiential knowledge. You can be fully in charge of your life only if you can acknowledge the reality of your body and all of its visceral dimensions." And he was quoting a Harvard professor who confessed how comforting it was to feel his wife's bum against him as he fell asleep at night. Our bodies need to feel safe. And so he shares this study, which, you know, if you're an animal rights person, it might be pretty traumatic to read, but he talks about dogs and mice and different things. But they did this experiment with dogs where they would shock them over and over and over and over again, and the control dogs weren't being shocked. And when they opened up the dog crate, the dogs that hadn't been shocked just run right out, but the dogs that had been shocked refused to leave the crate, and how the only way to get them out was to forcibly pull them out and show them that they were safe, and to do it over and over and over again. And he says the same is true for people. Many people will return to an abusive situation or return back to harmful, awful family systems or harmful, awful relationships because it's what they know. And they don't know that they're going to be okay if they leave that system. So they return to it over and over again. And one of the questions that was submitted was about that. He tells this story of a student, and if depending on what book you have it, on hers it's on page 38. I'm not sure what page it is on mine, but anyhow, he tells this story of a student who had grown up. She was abused. She had been raped. Lots of bad things had happened. And at some point, she enrolled in school and was kind of able to turn that around a little bit. Things were going really well. And then something shifted and things weren't going well anymore. And she turned again to an abusive relationship. And so the question here is, it says, said patient Claudia, who was a receptionist after rehab, continued to go back to her pimp. Do you think that those who go through treatment, it is important for them to be connected to a community? Because the author says on page 38, restoring relationships and community is central to restoring well-being. That being in a supportive community may help traumatize people not to be addicted to trauma. I mean, I wonder what you all think, because I don't know, I'm not a professional in this field, but it seems that this book so far would indicate that, but I would add, and I imagine it's going to get there, that the kind of community that you're in is important, you know, a supportive community, but a healthy one. And I'm hopeful that this book might give us some tools for that, because I think that's something that many of us are hoping to be a part of. To be a part of communities that help to heal and restore others. Someone had mentioned that they are in the Stephen Ministers program and how they're hoping this book will help with that. All right, so I'd be interested to hear what other people think about what kind of community a person who has been extremely traumatized and who needs restoration, what kind of community that person should be in, and what kind of supports the people within that community should have so that they continue to support the person. All right. So Rhonda says, I've seen tremendous benefit from medication for some people. It gives them a basis or a foundation to continue to function while they work on issues. A lot of people on medication, let's see, just stop at that point. They don't continue to work in therapy or on underlying issues. Thank you, Rhonda, because I think the whole point of this chapter was medicine is not bad, but medicine is not the only answer. And it sounds to me like the whole thesis of the book is that there's this three-pronged approach, talking, medicine, and moving your body. And which is interesting because he also talks about how some people deal with their trauma is to do yoga and run and things, and how sometimes even those people are fixating, if they're not careful, on the pain that they feel. You know, you hear about the pain of running a marathon or overcoming a wall, and how that's some kind of endorphin release or stimuli that those folks are looking for. And I found myself wondering, well, would he say that that's healthy or it's not healthy? Or let's say you're a marathon runner and your body breaks down and you can't run anymore, then what do you do to replace that need? So I found that curious. Okay, so in summary of this chapter, at the back of the chapter, it says the brain disease model overlooks 4 fundamental truths. 1, our capacity to destroy with one another is matched by our capacity to heal one another. Restoring relationships and community is central to restoring well-being, which is what this question that was submitted was about. 2, giving language gives us the power to change ourselves and others by communicating our experiences, helping us to define what we know, and finding a common sense of meaning. 3, we have the ability to regulate our own physiology, including some of the so-called involuntary functions of the body and brain, those through such basic activities as moving, breathing, and touching, which again, that's, you know, talking about the security of laying next to your partner's bum at night. And then 4, we can change social conditions to create environments in which children and adults can feel safe and where they can thrive. And then he says, when we ignore these things, we deprive people of ways to heal from trauma and restore their autonomy. So he says it's important to be a participant in your healing process, not to just be the patient, but to be a participant in it. And I don't know about you, I don't know how many of you have worked through traumas, but that's incredibly important. You can't you can't just let life happen to you. You have to be part of your healing process, which is extremely hard, and you need a community around you to help. And I wonder, so I guess in conclusion, I wonder what you thought about the chapter. I wonder if any of this resonated with you. So what did you think? What resonated with you? What questions do you have? And how so far do you think that this might benefit a community, right? So hopefully all of us are part of some kind of community, whether it's a faith community or a small group community or a neighborhood community. So how could this help us as communities? So what do you think? What questions do you have? What resonated with you? And how could this help our communities? As an aside to that, what I would say is if we could just be really cautious about the language that we use here and use trigger warnings in what we write if we need to, because some of our stories can kind of re-traumatize one another. So, you know, let's just lay it out there. If you're going to share something that is particularly traumatic, if you could put a trigger warning on it, that would be really good. So I think I'll leave it at there, other than to say I did like these. It got my mind spinning a lot about some things in my past with my childhood, and helped me think through some patterns, and helped me think through how some of the treatments that I've received didn't work, and how some of the communities that I've been a part of have been a huge part of my own healing. All right, so I hope that you all have a wonderful day, and we're going to move on to chapters 3 and 4 on Thursday. All right. Be well, have a good day, and talk to you soon, and keep commenting here, please. All right, bye-bye.